Hi there, welcome to our channel where we talk about traffic operations in practice. The overall intent of this video series is to reduce the learning curve for students and entry-level engineers by providing them free and high-quality learning materials in the field of traffic operations, including highway safety and travel demand modeling. The majority of content in this work is written by Professor Jiangling. My name is Amit Kumar Singh. I'm one of the contributor of this work. I'm a licensed engineer in the state of Texas. I received my bachelor's from IIT Bombay in India and my master's from UT Austin in US. Other three contributors of this work are Priyanshu Singh, who works in the field of artificial intelligence, Nidhi Kumari, who has a background in computer science and is a programmer, and Namrata Kumari. She has a background in electrical engineering and currently she is working as data scientist. Now let's get to the main content. Welcome to chapter 3, travel demand forecasting. This is one of my favorite topic in entire traffic operations. Travel demand forecasting is done to predict the traffic volumes either for the future conditions or under different alternatives. So usually we have the traffic volumes for existing conditions by collecting data in the field or by collecting data through some other sources, and then we are trying to forecast traffic volumes either for the future conditions or for the alternatives which are different than the existing conditions. Like I mentioned, this is my favorite topic because of all the mathematics that goes behind it. It's very intriguing, it's very interesting topic for me. Travel demand forecasting is one of the most important topic in traffic operations. It kind of lays the foundation of what is needed in the transportation system. Usually we forecast the volume for future and under different conditions. So it lays the foundation of the needs that are gonna be there in the future. So if we forecast for a reason and let's say the forecasts are too high, then there may be a lot of needs for transportation system, or if the traffic forecast for the future are low, then we might be looking at some smaller improvements. So the role traffic demand forecasting plays in transportation project is very big. All the roadway elements, all the capacity improvements are all dictated by travel demand models, or the output of travel uh, all depends on the output of traffic volume forecast. So let's say the left turn at certain intersection is forecasted to be high, then we might need to have protected left turns, or we might need a alternate intersection design, or if it's too high then we might need a direct connector connecting two roads. So depending on what the number we are forecasting, the design, traffic operations, simulations, anything that goes after forecasting the volume, everything changes very quickly. So it's very important to have a good understanding of traffic volume forecasting. It's very interesting, very intriguing, and it's one of my favorite topics. There are certain things I wanted to discuss based on my personal experience in the field, uh, and I have prepared some notes for it. Before that, let's look at what we are going to cover in this chapter. So in this chapter we will look at different techniques of doing traffic volume for. One of them is growth rate method, then next one is trip generation distribution method, or also known as traffic impact analysis, uh, which are a lot of analysis we do as a young engineer, especially for a small and mid-sized company. Traffic impact analysis are typically done for private developers. Let's say somebody is trying to put a gas station, a private developer is trying to build a gas station or a residential area or a commercial, then there will be some additional trips generated from those new developments or reconstructions of the same development. Then we need to know how many trips are they gonna be there on the roadway. So that's the second one, trip generation distribution method, which is traffic impact analysis. And the third one, where we will spend majority of our time, is travel demand modeling. Travel demand modeling is a very powerful tool to forecast future traffic volumes. So travel demand modeling section is split into two parts. First one is theory, where we will cover the theory behind four-step travel demand model. There is another activity-based travel demand model. We'll touch base on that one. And then we will look at how these travel demand models are built in reality, how they are implemented, and how they are used. So three different things: how these travel demand models are built, how they are implemented, what goes behind those models, what do they mean, what is the intent behind every concept, and then we will look at how to use it. So in all the presentations or in all the videos, when I'm presenting the concepts, the most important aspect to learn is the intent of certain things, why that concept is there, why is relevant. It's not only important to understand the value of a parameter is between 2 to 3 or 2.2 or something. It's also very important to understand why that parameter exists, what does it do, what is the intent behind having that parameter in the model or the simulation or the software itself. So when I read through guidelines or when I read through manuals, uh, the one thing I look for is the intent behind different concepts that are there, and not only what is that concept and how we can use those concepts. I also look for the intent behind those concepts when we are reading through manuals and guidelines. So that's a kind of a general overview of what we will be doing. Since there is a lot of topics to discuss, I think there will be between 10 to 20 videos on this chapter. We will try to cover the core concepts that are used in traffic demand forecasting. Next, I briefly wanted to mention some of my personal experiences with travel demand modeling. So, my personal experience, again, this is just my personal experience, is travel demand model is one of the most misunderstood and incorrectly done work in the industry. Most of the time, when a consultant or an engineer are working on travel demand model, they are building their own models, is kind of not well handled. That's why a lot of agencies do their travel demand modeling in house, and usually they give uh, output of the travel demand model. So care should be taken when using the travel demand models or any kind of techniques for the forecast. To deliver a good forecast, uh, the engineer needs to have a deeper understanding of mathematics and concept behind the travel demand models and traffic volume forecasting methods. A good engineer needs to understand the basic concepts, the mathematics that goes behind all this forecasting to fully embrace the models and fully utilize the uh, models in the right manner. So, kind of just wanted to touch base that this is not something uh, that straightforward, and it's usually kind of misunderstood and incorrectly used uh, in the field or in the day-to-day job. So through this video, we will look at the standard and guidance that are needed to perform traffic volume forecast, the struggles we have as young engineers or travel demand forecasters, what kind of struggles we face, and some of the common mistakes. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of mistakes we make uh, in the field of travel demand modeling. So, what are some of the common mistakes, why they happen, and then what are the solutions to those mistakes? As we grow in our career as traffic engineer, we specialize in certain fields. So, some engineers get specialization in travel demand modeling, some engineers work in highway safety, some engineers work in planning, some engineers work in micro simulation. As we grow more and more senior in our career as an engineer, we typically grow in certain fields. We do not do simulation and safety and demand modeling and planning, and we do not get to do everything because of the time and the charge rate or the money which is required for the project. So I kind of wanted to bring this up because the amount of information in this chapter called travel demand forecasting can be a little bit too much, especially for students and entry level engineers. However, we should understand that not everyone needs to understand everything. Typically, towards the, let's say, after 5 years of our career, the engineers would start to specialize in one field, so only one of the chapters will be applicable to them. So that's the intent. So it can be helpful for the students and entry level engineers, and as well as folks who are specializing in certain fields. So do not get overwhelmed by the amount of information we are going to provide here. And you need to have some understanding of different concepts, and then once you start to specialize in certain field, then you can focus on that particular chapter only. Next, I briefly wanted to mention some of my personal experiences with travel demand modeling. So my personal experience, again, this isn't just my personal experience, is travel demand model is one of the most misunderstood and incorrectly done work in the industry. Most of the time when a consultant or an engineer are working on travel demand model, they are building their own models. It's, it's kind of not well handled. That's why a lot of agencies do their travel demand modeling in house, and usually they give uh, output of the travel demand model. So care should be taken when using the travel demand models or any kind of techniques for the forecast. To deliver a good forecast, uh, the engineer needs to have a deeper understanding of mathematics and concept behind the travel demand models and traffic volume forecasting methods. A good engineer needs to understand the basic concepts, the mathematics that goes behind all this forecasting to fully embrace the models and fully utilize the uh, models in the right manner. So, kind of just wanted to touch base that this is not something that straightforward, and it's usually kind of misunderstood and incorrectly used uh, in the field or in the day to day job. So, through this video, we will look at the standard and guidance that are needed to perform traffic volume forecast, the struggles we have as young engineers or travel demand forecasters, what kind of struggles we face, and some of the common mistakes. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of mistakes we make uh, in the field of travel demand modeling. So, what are some of the common mistakes, why they happen, and then what are the solutions to those mistakes, and the reasoning behind why something is wrong. Let's say we are looking at 100 different travel demand model work or traffic volume forecasting work. We might end up with 100 different answer. So let's say there is a roadway and 100 different forecasters are forecasting volumes for that particular roadway. Then there are chances that all 100 of them will come up with a different answer, and not all of them can be correct. So we need to understand what goes behind the travel demand model, what are the right ways, what are the best ways, what are the best practices, and in general, one of the sources of mistakes, I kind of just wanted to discuss this here, that one of the sources of mistake is our brain as an engineer get hardwired to think in a certain way or do projects in a certain way. So when we are working on the project for first time, second time, then we read through manuals and we think a lot of things we learn through our supervisors, our colleagues and stuff. And then there is a time and budget constraint which kicks in, and then we need to finish the project faster. When we are working on the same project, let's say we have delivered a good work for 5 projects and then we are working on 6 projects, there are very less chances that we would actually go back and read through all the manuals and try to have deeper understanding of things. After working on projects certain number of times, an engineer brain, I feel that get hardwired to think in the certain way and do things faster in a certain way, because we are always bound by the time, and the charge rate to do the work we do is very high, so we are always bound by the time that are allotted, and we do not have always the time to think, uh, think out of the box whether it's right or wrong. It's really difficult to break the established method or protocols which has already been approved or already been going in a certain way. uh, so this I feel like is one of the most common sources of mistake we have in traffic operations in general, and not only for travel demand modeling. In my personal opinion, the best way to find and address these mistakes is to have an independent QC. QC is quality check. So if someone else is looking at your work, and the person is knowledgeable, then they can point out um, different way of doing things, or maybe some of the mistakes we are carrying forward. I have seen several travel demand modeling work that has been done for, let's say, last 20 years, and it was wrong. It was wrong for entire 20 years or something. It might happen to myself as an engineer too, where I truly believe that the concepts and approach I am using is correct, and then it out that okay, some of the aspect is maybe not that correct. So it's very important to get your work checked by someone knowledgeable and have a fresh set of eyes to point out the mistakes, because an engineer brain gets hardwired to think in a certain way. I feel like it's very important for a knowledgeable and outside person to critique your work. uh, Again, the travel demand modeling is such an important concept that we do not just go and forecast and just give the numbers to client. Usually there are two round of interaction with client. First one is through tra- um, traffic volume forecasting memo, where we write all our approaches and assumptions and we send it for client approval. In this assumption memo, what we call it, in this traffic forecasting assumption memo, list all the assumptions we are going to make, we list all the equations we are going to use, we list almost all the procedures there and have the client review them and see whether they are happy with the approach. On if and only if client approves the approach, then we actually go and do the forecasting. So since this is such a complex and such a crucial work, we do not directly jump and spend months of work and then later turn out one of the assumptions does not make sense. So after approach memo is approved, we go back and do the work, and then we produce the final numbers. Usually the final numbers needs to be have something called sanity check or something to see whether it actually makes sense, and then we send it back to the client and try to. Client is usually State Department of Transportation. So we send it back to the client and they can look at the numbers, look at our method, look at the models we have used and see whether they agree with our numbers. Usually it does not happen in the first iterations. There are 2 or 3 iterations where we get the feedback, we revise the model or counter the argument, and then it goes back and forth for few times before the numbers are finalized. So I kind of wanted to share these things at the beginning of video. This video is going to be long, interesting, and it's gonna be definitely fun going through this chapter. If you have already started working on a project in travel demand model, so I would highly recommend to go on the last page of this chapter, which is on page 65, and look at some of the important lesson learned or author's opinion on the travel demand model before working on project. So there are some important tips, guidelines that are provided on the last page of this chapter. And if you are working on a project, I would highly recommend to read through 3.5.5 author's opinion before working on project. So let's get started on this very interesting, very important journey called travel demand forecasting. Now let's get to the main content of this work. Traffic volume forecasting is just predicting or estimating the number of vehicles that will be there for any year in the future, or sometimes in the existing for alternatives. So correctly estimating future travel demand is crucial and challenging task because there are many things that is going to change in future. Travel mode might change, autonomous vehicles may come in, the land pattern will change, the mode will change. There are many changes. People's income will change. Maybe there will there will be more bikers than cars, or maybe there will be new train system, or people may be driving more. Many things can change in the future, so correctly estimating future travel demand is a very important and very challenging task. If we underestimate the traffic demand, then we can build a transportation system that will fail, and the demand will exceed the capacity and the transportation system will fail. On the other hand, if we underestimate the demand, then we might build certain infrastructure that is not needed. And usually the road transportation infrastructure is very expensive. They cost millions of dollars. They take a long duration to work on, so we don't want to build something that is not needed. So predicting the future volume, usually 25 years down the line, is kind of challenging task and needs a deeper understanding of travel demand models. So in this chapter, we will discuss three important ways of predicting the future volumes. First one is growth rate method, which we use for planning studies. For planning studies and studies that are not in depth, or let's say even for the IAJRs. IAJR is Interstate Access Justification Reports, which we use for interstates. So even for IAJR, we do not go and do full-blown travel demand model. So growth rate is what is commonly used to predict the future traffic demand. If a travel demand model is available, then that becomes a different complicated project in itself. So we use travel demand model for certain projects, or sometimes agencies run travel demand model for us and just give us the output. So there are three ways of predicting future traffic volumes. One is growth rate method, and second one is trip generation distribution method, also known as traffic impact studies, or TIA, traffic impact analysis, and the third one is travel demand modeling. So for this video, let's focus on the growth rate method. Growth rate method is pretty simple. Growth rate method focuses on future travel demand based on historic trend in traffic growth. So what we do is we look at the historic data, usually past 20 years, and see what the growth was, and kind of extrapolate it from the current year into the future. That's the growth rate method. It's very simple. We look at past 20 years, figure out the growth using different functions, and then we just extrapolate it in the future. There are two traffic growth rate models that are widely used in practice. One is linear growth rate model, one is compounded growth rate, also known as exponential growth rate. So several states use linear and several states use compound growth rates. Compound growth rate, what it says is, as the volume will grow in the future, the number of new addition to the current system will be higher. So similar idea to the linear simple interest rate versus compounded interest rate. So what compound does, it builds on top of each other, whereas linear growth rate is a constant number which gets added to every year. So that's a two major difference between linear and compounded. For PE exam and for most of the exams, we use a compounded growth rate. Usually traffic volumes is supposed to increase. Let's say if I have 1,000 vehicles now, then and it is increased to 1,100, then there is an increase by 100 vehicles. But in future, if I have 2000 vehicles, then if it increases by 100, then it becomes linear growth rate. If it increases by 200, then it becomes compounded growth rate. So that's the main difference between linear and compounded. Compounded is kind of seems intuitive and fit mathematically. However, research has shown that compounded annual growth rate has potential or sometimes overestimates the actual growth. So growth does not just happen every year. So there are some years where growth goes up pretty high, and then some year the growth goes down. So let's say a lot of people because of inflation, a lot of people doesn't have disposable income, and they didn't buy new cars, and so the traffic on the road is low. Or let's say when the inflation is a lot of new drivers on the road for certain years. So all this combined together, answers lie somewhere between linear and compounded. Compounded is what we use like in exams and stuff, but linear is what kind of used in practice in certain state. For example, Texas uses linear growth rate. So it has been found that even though mathematically or just using our intuition, it seems that compounded growth rate is the right answer, but usually compounded growth rate overestimates the traffic volume. So a linear growth rate is typically used. Typically, past 20 years to 30 years of historical AADT data is used to conduct regression analysis and determine the anticipated growth rate. So, we looked at the regression analysis in chapter 2. Usually, past 20 to 30 years of data is gathered, and a regression analysis is run on them. Growth rates are then applied to existing volumes to estimate future volumes. A common growth rate can be applied to entire study area or individual element of the study. So we will look at an example which is provided on next page. Here is some traffic volumes, and here is 2% growth rate. This is annual growth rate. So this is year 2020, this is year 2040, and this 2% is applied on the entire intersection, means that every number has been grown by 2%. In this one, different growth rates are applied to different approaches, so that's another way of applying growth rate. Sometimes some of the, let's say in this case, let's say there is going to be more volumes like this, and then there will be going to be more volume predicted through this road. So the different leg of the intersection may experience different growth, and that's why for some cases we apply different growth rate to different legs. So we will look at these two examples and try to solve them in Excel soon. A common growth rate can be applied for entire study area or individual element of the study, like I mentioned. Uh, Usually the growth rates, even though if we calculate it from the data, sometime it comes negative, sometime it can be very low number. Standard practice is to use a minimum of 2% linear growth rate. So a minimum of 2% linear growth rate is applied or used in practice, and if the growth rate is higher than 2%, then we use that growth rate. Growth rate typically lies between 2 to 4%. If the growth rate is higher than 4%, then we need to be very careful about using that growth rate. Growth rate can bump up number really fast, and if we are using a number higher than 4%, or 4% annual compounded or 5% linear. So let's say if we are using a higher growth rate greater than 5% linear, then the numbers can go up. We might have to increase the roadway capacity significantly to accommodate that demand. So here are few important details about use of growth rate in practice. The growth rate assumes that the future growth in the study area would be similar to past growth in the area. So one big disadvantage of growth rate is it looks at the historical data, but it cannot accommodate the future data. So when we are using the growth rate method, there is no way of accommodating the new development that will come in. So let's say an area has expanded very fast during past 5 to 10 years. It doesn't mean it's gonna keep expanding in the future, or on the contrary, if the area has not developed recently but there are many land development plans that are going to develop the area, then growth rate method will not be able to capture those things, because we are using a historical linear regression based analysis. What we can do is we can figure out the trips and apply an equivalent growth rate, but that becomes complicated. If the anticipated future growth area is expected to be different than historical growth, then the engineer can use his or her engineering judgment to determine the anticipated growth rate instead of historical growth rate. Yeah, this is the complicated part, where if there are land developments or growth is going to be different than historical growth rate, then engineer should be careful, and he or she can apply their engineering judgment to figure out what growth rate to be used. Usually this growth rates needs to be approved by client. Traffic volume forecasting is a very crucial step. Usually what we do is we write a memo, uh, which is called traffic forecasting methodology memo. So first we write the traffic forecasting methodology memo, which outlines the steps we are going to take as for the project to start the forecasting. And once the memo is approved and the approach or the mathematics or the formulas are approved, then we go and apply it, and then we predict the volumes, and then the final numbers are also needs to be approved by client. So when we are writing our traffic forecasting approach memo, that we can mention all the assumption and engineering judgment involved, and that's the step one where client needs to approve those assumptions and judgments. Growth rate method is a quick and convenient way to to forecast future traffic volumes. That's why it's heavily used in transportation planning, where we don't want too much detail, but we want some good results pretty fast. It's primarily used to forecast traffic volume for near term within 5 years of existing data, or forecast traffic for roadways located in rural areas. In practice, there may be situations where calculated growth rate is very low or even negative. As a conservative assumption, a minimum linear growth rate of 2% is typically used in practice. So what we will do is we will go beyond the application of this growth rate, and what I will do is I'll walk everyone through the Excel on how these calculations are done. So there are two ways of applying growth rate. We will look in Excel on how these calculations are done. Then we will look at some of the important characteristics of the growth rate. Then we will look at some of the common mistakes that are made in practice when we are applying the growth rate. So growth rate are kind of easy, kind of complicated, depending on whether the engineer which is using it understand is fully or not. So we will look at some of the common mistakes that are frequently found, I would say, in a lot of projects currently present. So we will look at some of the common mistakes, what is the reason behind those mistakes, and how we can resolve them. So let's look at the two example problems we have in the video and the PDF. So let's say we have this turning moment counts. A turning moment counts is typically summarized for the peak hour of the day and for 1 hour. So this 30 left turn here means there are 30 vehicles turning left during peak hour. Let's say for an assumption. Assuming that the up is north, the approach names are as follows. The up is northbound, so this approach where 370 volume is there is the northbound approach. This approach is the westbound approach. This approach is the southbound approach, and this approach is the eastbound approach. Now let's say we are going to apply 2% growth on the to the entire intersections. So if we are looking to apply 2% growth at this intersection, so I have put 2% here. Let's say this is our existing year 2020, and then we are trying to apply 2% to forecast it for 2040. So what we will do is we will write, and this 2%, let's say for this example, is annual compounded. It can be linear, and then we will use the linear equation. For this example, let's say it's annual compounded. So is equal to this number multiplied by 1.02 to the power 20. That becomes our forecasted number. And if we drag it, then these numbers become the forecasted volume. However, we don't know the actual volume in the future, so is usually the future forecasted volumes are rounded off. Depending on how big the number is, the rounding number of digits for rounding changes. There are many guidelines, the state DOT's guidelines that tells us how many digits we need to round off. So if the volume falls within this range, round off one digit. If volume falls under certain range, then round off up to other digits. So for this example, let's round it off to the nearest tenth. So I'm going to round it here using round function. Rounding is very important. It kinds of shows that forecasting for future is not an exact science. Let's say we are forecasting 50 years in the future, we cannot say there will be 1749 vehicles, because our models cannot predict to that level of significance or that number of digits. So we usually round it off when we are presenting the final numbers. So let's just round it off with to nearest 10 for example here. And then what I will do is I'll copy paste this over for other locations. And now we are done with the first part of the PDF, where we are using 2% growth rate to forecast future volume for entire intersection. Now let's look at the second example, where we are using different growth rate for different approaches. So this approach has 2% growth, which is already applied. So this approach has 2% growth. This approach has 3%. This approach has 5%. And this approach has 4% growth. So the same formula, instead of 2%, we will just use 3% here, and then just drag it down. Here, instead of 3%, we will use 4%. Just drag it to the right. Here, instead of 2%, we will switch this to 5%. This is a quick and simple example of growth rate and the application of growth. Next, we will look at some of the concepts that are related to growth rate, some of the properties of growth rate, and common mistakes while we use growth rate method in practice. Let's look at some of the state guidelines and how to apply them. So today we will specifically look at TXDOT-TPP guidelines. TXDOT is Texas Department of Transportation. That's the leading state agencies for transportation project in the state of Texas. And the TPP division within TXDOT, they do many things, and one of them is to provide guidance for traffic volume forecasting for the state projects. So in this subtopic, we will look at first the introduction to growth rate, how those growth rates are calculated using examples. Then what is the TPP guidelines to calculate them, and common mistakes that occurs, and something to avoid. So here I have 9 years worth of data, and every year the traffic is growing by 100 vehicles. So here the traffic is growing by 100 vehicles every year, and the data lies on a straight line. So now the question is, what is the linear growth rate? And ideally the question should be, what is the linear growth rate based on this data, and what is the linear growth rate we are going to use for the project. So based on this historical data, you know, if we consider 2001 as base, we can say every year the volume is increasing by 10% of this number. So it may look like the linear growth rate is 10%, but is this what we are going to use for the project, or is this correct? So the way we can calculate linear growth rate is we take the final number 1900 minus subtract out the first number, and the difference is 900 divided by difference in number of years. So 2010 minus 2001, which is 9 years, and base, which is 10,000, and this gives us 0.1, which is 10%. So is this the right way of calculating growth rate? So we will have a look. And is for a project, if this data is given, what growth rate are we going to use for the project? We will look at that too. In this slide, the curve is exponential curve, and uh, the rate is compounded. So in this case, every year the numbers are increasing by 10% of the previous number. So here a 10% increase, a 10% increase from previous, which is what annual compounded growth rate looks like. So here the annual compounded growth rate is 10%, but is this what we are going to use for a project? So we'll look at that one. And what are the guidelines on if this data is given to us and we want to use annual compounded growth rate, how will we calculate this growth rate? So we'll look at what are the guidelines to calculate the growth rate. Are we going to use these two numbers, or are we going to this number and this number? Like, which numbers we will use, how will we use them? Because here we have 9 set of numbers, sorry, 10 set of numbers for um, a 9-year increment. So which numbers are we going to use? So we'll look at how to calculate these growth rates, and then also how to apply them. So linear growth rate, like I mentioned from high school, is very easy. Future number minus present number divided by present number multiplied by number of years. This is from 9th grade or even earlier. Annual compounded growth rate is the similar. Future number is equal to present number multiplied by 1 plus r. R is the growth rate to the power n number of years. So growth rate can be given by future divided by present to the power 1 by n minus 1. Before we jump into guidelines, I want to explain there are two distinctions of growth rate. One is called historic growth rate, one is called future growth rate. Historic growth rate is how the traffic, let's look at the growth rate in terms of traffic. So historic growth rate is how the traffic has grown over past several years. So let's say my data point is like this. So this is, let's call it 2000, let's just call it 2000, and let's say we are here in 2019 before pandemic, and this is my linear fit. So the growth rate at which the historical data was increasing, or the historical ADT was increasing, the growth rate that is applicable to historical data is called historical growth rate. And the growth rate we are going to use for the future is called future growth rate. So let's say we are in 2019 and then we are trying to forecast for 2050. So the growth rate we are going to use to forecast is um, future growth rate. So these are two different things, and we will come to the we'll look at the difference more closely as we go through some examples. So two important things: the growth rate, which we calculate from the data in using historical data, is historical growth rate that represents the growth that has happened in the past. Future growth rate is a growth rate that we calculate to project the existing volume, to the future volume. That's future growth rate. This is what we use in project, and this is what we calculate from the, this is typically what we calculate from the data. And then what is the relationship between them is another question. So let's look at the TPP guidelines to calculate growth rate. So the TPP guidelines are, first one is the regression. Um, let's not worry about this. So first one is regression. So the TPP guidelines is, instead of using 2 years worth of data, we should run a regression analysis on the data and then try to figure out the growth rate. Now, some of the benefits of running regression over just using 2 years worth of data. So when we are saying 2 years worth of data is basically taking the first number and taking the last number and trying to figure out the growth rate. Instead of using two numbers, the TPP guideline is to run a regression line which uses all the data points and then figure out the growth rate based on the regression line. So it's more reliable growth rate because it uses all the numbers. It doesn't only depend on last two. Regression to the mean concept is gonna kick in highway safety. So what it says is during certain years the volume goes up, and then after some time the volume goes down, or some data set, then after some time the data set goes up and then goes down, and overall the average lies on the curve but the data point lies above or below. So maybe the data point has this trend to it in the short term. So this is called regression to the mean, where it may seem that data is increasing here, then in short term decreasing, then short term increasing. So when we run the regression, it avoids this issue. And then the third one is faulty single layer data. So let's say instead of this number, there was sensor error of, or for some reason in this year traffic volume was a little bit higher and the future volume is correct. So when we calculate the growth rate based on the first point and the last point, and if one of the data point is faulty, then we will end up with the wrong growth rate. Whereas when we run the regression analysis, even if some of the data point are off, it kind of adjusts those. So in practice, if we see one outlier, let's say there is one outlier, we manually just remove it and use the data points that are reasonable. So we do look for outliers in practice. So growth rate calculations change from using 2 years data point to a regression line. That's the guidance one on calculating the growth rate. The second guidance is now we can use a linear growth rate and annual compounded growth rate. So annual compounded growth rate is like an exponential curve, is used for PE exam. It looks is kind of given in all the books. Um, Most of the books we will read has annual compounded growth rate. And then there is linear growth rate. Some of the research shows that annual compounded growth rate overestimates the future volume. So if we are trying to forecast the future volume based on annual compounded growth rate, it kind of overshoots where it needs to be. So let's say the actual number is here, it overshoots. So many agencies look at the linear growth rate or prefer the linear growth rate, which fits a linear curve. In my opinion, linear curve slightly underestimates it, but it's better than overshooting the projections, because a little bit change in projections have a huge impact on transportation projects. The capacity needs to be increased by large amount. For example, let's say the volume projected for left turn is around 400, then we might be looking at 2 lane left turns, and if it's like 600 or 700, then we might be looking at a direct connector, which is a big investment compared to adding left turns or signals. So TPP's second guideline is to use linear growth rate. Even though book, research, and all our academics is based on annual compounded growth rate, the guideline for Texas and some other state is to use linear growth rate. Several DOTs, what they do is they look at both and try to see what is the right way on case by case basis. So for example, let's say linear growth rate came out to be 5%, annual compounded um, came out to be 3%. Then we forecast volume based on both and try to see which one kind of makes sense more. So that's the linear growth rate. So even though intuition and everything says um, kind of traffic should increase with annual compounded growth rates, because let's say there are 1,000 vehicles now and there are 1,500 vehicles now, 1,500 vehicles let's say in the future, then next year there are chances that the number increase will be higher than current. However, it's it's been shown in the research that the linear growth rate fits the overall curve better. Now let's look at following terms. So first one is past 20 years data. Like I mentioned, we typically use past 20 years worth of data to play around and figure out the growth rate. So let's say I'm looking at 2000 and 20 2020. So 2020 what was a COVID year and usually not used. So let's say I have 1919. Sorry, let's say my start year is 1999 and my latest year is 2019. Because 2020 was COVID year, we usually exclude them. And this is my data point. So that's the past 20 years data. Count year is the year in which count is collected. So let's say I went and go ahead and filled and collected count in 2022. That becomes my count year. All the growth rate, future growth rate will be applied onto the count year. So all the growth rate we are trying to calculate will be applied on the count year. That's an important fact to remember. Base year is also called opening year. Opening year. So opening year is when the project is going to be open. Usually is if I'm working in 2022, uh, opening year may lie between 2030 to 2035, sometime 2027 depending on the size of project. So let's call the opening year 2030 just for a reference on. This is a realistic reference. The projects I'm working on in 2022 have 2030. Most of the projects have 2030 as their opening year. The design year is usually 20 years ahead of opening year, which is 2050. Pivot growth rate. Pivot growth rate is a concept. So when we apply the growth rate on the count year, we usually apply up to 20 years. So let's say 2022 is my count year, and then 2050 is when I'm trying to project 2050. So usually when we project in the future, we only project using the growth rate up to 20 year, which takes us to 2042. After 2042, we use a different growth rate called pivot growth rate and is usually set to 2%. The logic behind using pivot growth rate is when the project opens, there is a ramp up period and there is a lot of demand that ramps up, so the growth rate kind of goes up. But after some time, when the area becomes saturated, the volume just does not keep growing at the same pace. So we pivot after 20 years and then we use 2% later on. Pivot growth rate is kind of fixed in Texas and is always 2% linear growth rate. So TPP recommends to use a minimum of 2% linear growth rate. So let's say we went ahead with the data and we calculated the growth rate to be 1.4%. So we will switch this to 2%. 2% is the minimum growth rate we use for projects. That's a conservative estimate if the growth rates are too small in the area. We exclude 2020-21 traffic data from our analysis because during COVID, the ADTs were smaller than a typical ADT. So that can change our analysis and affect the growth rate we are going to use for our analysis. Common mistakes. The first mistakes is the first mistake is the So the first mistake is the term growth rate. So the mistakes usually happen because the term growth rate is kind of used in many different fields, in finance, um, in biology, or it's used in many fields. Growth rate is not a new term. Almost everyone has heard about it, but typically the way growth rates are calculated is we look at one data point in the past, one data point in the future, and then try to see what happened based on these two data points. So just by comparing two data points, we calculate the growth rate. However, in traffic operations, we use a regression analysis. So when we do not use regression analysis and go with the common term as we know as the growth rate, then that's the source of mistake number one. So to correct this mistake, we need to use the regression analysis. Now the third point is kind of important, that when we are working with historic growth rate, we need to run regression analysis, but several times we also need to look at the future growth that is provided in statewide planning maps. So there are statewide planning maps which provides the predicted future number throughout the state. So let's say planning map is out for 2020, so it will provide the future number for 2040 for several locations in the state, and most of the roads are covered by this location. So if we want to calculate the growth rate and try to see what is the forecasted growth rate by the state agency within their planning map is, then we will use two data points because we do not have any information in between. In this case, we will look at historic growth rate and then state provided growth rate. State provided this future growth rate using 2 points. Historic growth rate is based on regression, and then try to compare them and try to come up with a consensus on which growth rate to use and how to use it. The second source of mistake is the word 20 years. Now the word 20 years can be used for using 20 years past historical data. It may seem that we always use 20 years of historical data, that's why we call it 20-year growth rate. But the fact is, even if we use 10 years of data, it's not called 10 years of growth rate. Or even if we use 5 years of data, it's not called 5-year growth rate. The growth rate is always called 20 years of growth rate, because using less data, let's say we only have 5 years of data, so only 5 data points. Even though we are using only 5 years of data to calculate growth rate, the growth rate is based on current year and future, like from where to where we are trying to project. Since we are trying to project 20 years ahead in the future, uh, irrespective of what number of years we use as the historical data, the growth rate is termed as 20-year growth rate, in at least in Texas, and I'm guessing several other places. So that's a confusion number one. So irrespective of how much data we are using from past, uh, the growth rate is always called 20-year growth rate. Now the term 20-year represents 20 years from the opening year. So in roadway design, and so second confusion happens because of the term 20 years, how it's used in roadway design and other kind of design in industry. So we have the first we have the count year, then we have the base or opening year, and then we have the design year, which is 20 year ahead. Design year is also called horizon year. So this design year is 20 year ahead of the opening year. However, the growth rate we calculate is applied on the count year. So the growth rate has this 20 years term in the roadway design is between opening and design. It has nothing to do with the count. However, the growth rate that we calculate is applied on the count. So this is kind of a confusing term, where the 20-year word comes from the roadway design, which is between opening and design, but it is applied on the count year. So the growth rate is called 20 years growth rate, but a 20 years growth rate or 20-year forecast, even if we are forecasting between 2022 and 2050 is still called 20-year forecast and 20-year growth rate. However, the difference is not 20 years. The difference is 28 year here because the opening year was 30 years. So this is another confusion when we forecast the volume is called 20 years growth rate or 20 years forecast, but the 20 year, the word 20 year means is between from opening year to design year is 20 years. However, the growth rate itself is based on the count year. So that's very confusing, and I wish the industry should stop saying 20-year growth rate or 20-year forecast, but it's not the case currently. So this is a confusion that comes from the standard term that is used in roadway, a 20-year, and we carry it forward in traffic, and it's very confusing. This is second source of mistake. This mistakes typically kicks in when we are writing report. This does not affect the analysis because we typically do use the correct years, but when we are writing the report, these two mistakes frequently happens. And the third and the biggest source of mistake is linear relationship with the base year. So one thing to remember is linear growth rate is dependent on the base year selection. So let's look at one example. Let's say the traffic in 2019 is 10,000 vehicles. This is ADT, and traffic in 2022 is 1,600 vehicles. What it means is every year 200 vehicles are getting added on the system, and if it lies on a linear curve, then every year we are adding 200 vehicles. So let's say we are trying to project for 2040, or let's say 2050. So if we are trying to project for 2050, then every year if 200 vehicles are getting added, then the future volume will be so 10,000 vehicles. Here we are adding 200 vehicles, so there will be 6,200 extra vehicles from this number. So it will be 16200, give or take. So if we calculate the growth rate using 2019 as our base year, then it will be 1,000 vehicles as the base. And but if we calculate growth rate based on 2022, then 10600 will be our base. If we calculate our growth rate based on 2030 numbers, then it will have a higher base number, because this increment of 200 is, if we calculate 2019 as base, then will be based on this 1,000. Here the growth rate, um, if is increasing 200 every year, and 2022 uh, is our base year, count year, then this 200 we will see what is the percentage this 200 representing out of 10600. So like we can see, since the increment every year is the same and the base is changing, so 200 is what percentage of 10,000 here, 200 is what percentage of 10600 here. Linear growth rate, let's say the growth rate here is x, then the growth rate here will be lower than x because it has a higher base. So the growth rate, depending on which year we are choosing, changes. So linear growth rate is dependent on the base year selection. This is the one most common mistake engineers make. What it also means is, in the first graph, when we are trying to calculate growth rate and we are calling it 10%, is based on 2001 as our base. But if our count year is somewhere here, let's say we collected count in 2013, we need to change the base year to 2013, the count year. So the count year is the year onto which all the growth rates will be multiplied. So what we do is we extend this line, figure out 2013 first, figure out the future number, and then calculate the growth rate. So the linear growth rate here is 10% historic, but the in project we are going to use a different growth rate which is based on 2013 as our base, and it will be much less than 10%. Let's say 7 to it will be like 7 to 9%. So this does not happen with annual compounded. Annual compounded growth rate applies on the previous number. So if the growth rate is 10% here, irrespective of whether I am basing it off this number or basing off this number, or I am extending it and basing it on a number here, the annual compounded growth rate always remains the same, because every year we are multiplying it by 1.1. So every year we are multiplying previous number by 1.1. So 1.1 and number of years get added up in terms of that power. So annual compounded growth rate, if we calculated 10%, we are going to use 10% for the future. So that's why annual compounded is kind of used in many fields, and it's kind of easier to play with. One single growth rate in annual compounded works for history, past, and it kind of more intuitive. However, linear growth rate changes based on the base year we are choosing. So going back to the guidelines, the third and very important thing to remember is linear growth rate is dependent on base year chosen. If we change our base year, let's say we were planning to collect data in 2022, we went with an agency and agency gave us go ahead to use 3% growth rate, and for some reason we did not collect the data for 2022 and we went ahead and collect the data for 2023. We cannot just go and use 3% growth rate. Either we can adjust this 3% to be slightly lower than 3. uh, we have to do the calculation. So either we can adjust it and get approval again, or we have to request this data again from the TPP division to ask which growth rate we should be using. So it's very, very important that linear growth rate is the year dependent. We cannot just take a growth rate and apply every year. However, this adjustment is small, and we can make a case that that we're gonna use 3% because there isn't much difference between 2022 and 2023. That's a different discussion. That's like a practical side of things where we don't want to go through, getting the data from TPP again, and it might take a long time and might kind of uh, changes the timeline of the project. But from mathematical side of things, we cannot change the years. If we have collected the data and the growth rate is meant for that particular year, either we have to recalculate it or we have to request the growth rate again. So this is the most common mistake that happens in industry and traffic operations, because the growth rates are year dependent. So the historical growth rate is not same as future growth rate. That's the first point. Second point is, even for the future growth rate, the base needs to be the constant, and it should not change for the project. So the growth rates uh, are calculated based on certain count year, certain year on which we are going to apply the projections in mind, and if that year changes, then we have to recalculate our growth. So there are some questions. I usually, when I present to students, I usually have these questions. So if a volume in the year 2020 is 10,000 vehicles per hour and historic linear growth rate is, let's say, 2%, what is the forecasted traffic volume in 2022? So the important term here is the historic. So what I will do is I'll go ahead and give the answer. You viewers can pause the video and think about it. So since the historic growth rate is 2%, is typically based on the lower number as the base. So let's say my historic growth rate when I started in 1919 up to 2019 is 2%, but the base will be a lower number. Now, since we are playing with a higher number as base, because we are given 2020 number, it's difficult to estimate 2022. So the answer is, since we do not know 2% of what number, because the history is not given. We don't know 2% of what. The answer is cannot be determined. The same question but with annual compounded growth rate. So if the volume is 10,000 vehicles and annual compounded growth rate is 2%, what is the forecasted traffic volume for the year 2022? So here we have the annual compounded growth rate, which is on exponential curve, and historical annual compounded growth rate is 2%. Now, as we discussed, the annual compounded growth rate is not base dependent, so we can apply 2% on top of this 10,000. However, linear growth rate is not, uh, it is base dependent. Annual compounded growth rate is not base dependent, so we can apply 2% here, and the answer is 10,404. Linear growth rate is base dependent, and we don't know 2% of what number, so we cannot just apply 2% on this 10,000. That's the kind of a intent of these two examples. Third one is a linear regression analysis was conducted using historic 20 years of data. Based on the linear regression, the historic growth rate was 4%. So the linear growth rate that will be used for project, let's say we collected data in 2021 to determine 2045 volume is. So what we did is we went ahead and calculated the growth rate based on linear regression, and we figure out is 4%. 4% of the base, which is the, here the base is 2000. So in year 2000, whatever the volume was, is 4% of that. So the linear growth rate that will be used to grow 2021 traffic volumes is, so since we are going to change the base and the base is a higher number, the growth rate will be a smaller number because we are still incrementing the same number of vehicles, but now we have a higher base. So it will be less than 4%. The same questions but with annual compounded growth rate. So we went ahead and failed and calculated the annual compounded growth rate to be 4%, and we used year 2000 as the present year. So let's say we use this year 2000 numbers as the base year, and then 2020 number as final year, and calculate 4% growth rate. And if we want to forecast future traffic growth, we will be still be using 4%. That's the property of annual compounded growth rate. It applies to any number. It just multiplies on top of the previous one. So if we went in field and calculated the growth rate to be 4%, using the historical data, we will be using 4% for the future project. So the answer to this question is 4%. Thank you very much. Hi there. Welcome to our channel where we talk about traffic operations in practice. Since this is our very first video, we would like to talk more about the intent of our work and what to expect from other videos on this channel. The overall intent of this video series is to reduce the learning curve for students and entry-level engineers by providing them free and high-quality learning materials in the field of traffic operations, including highway safety and travel demand modeling. The majority of content in this work is written by Professor Jiangling. My name is Amit Kumar Singh. I'm one of the contributor of this work. I'm a licensed engineer in the state of Texas. I received my bachelor's from IIT Bombay in India and my master's from UT Austin in US. Other three contributors of this work are Priyanshu Singh, who works in the field of artificial intelligence, Nidhi Kumari, who has a background in computer science and is a programmer, and Namrata Kumari. She has a background in electrical engineering and currently she is working as data scientist.